I've got two titles for this talk. One is what I'm trying to do, and the other is what am I trying to do? And I think an artist should be trying to do something, but what happens is that what you're trying to do doesn't become clear until you start trying to do it. So I don't know what I'm trying to do with my next book, but I wish I did. I will find out. Now, I'm an architect, got the papers to prove it. I hardly ever use them now. And when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a writer. And they say, you're a writer, what do you write about? And I say, architecture. And in the days when I was an architect, before I started writing, people used to say, what do you do? And I said, I'm an architect. And they say, what kind of buildings do you do? Which, it was an annoying question. I mean, it's not a good question because I was always aware that architecture was more than buildings, but I didn't know at the time what that meant. I was just sort of being an architect and trying to figure out how to do it. In fact, the work I was doing was brief writing for National Health Service, A&E unit. We were working on a template hospital in Guildford, no, in Newham. Template means it's identical to others built with the same tranche of money around the country. So the one in Guildford was getting on fine with 10,000 accident and emergency patients a year. The one in Newham was struggling to cope with 50,000 a year because life in Poplar is that much more violent than life in Guildford, obviously. People beat each other up more and get drunker and fall off balconies more. And so the job was to try and streamline the throughput of the A&E unit. And if that sounds, it wasn't boring work, but it was good work, you know, because you're surrounded by the people who ran the unit, the doctors and nurses, the porters, the cleaners, all trying to do their best in a difficult situation. But there was no art in it. There was no emotion in it, which is weird, isn't it, in an accident and emergency. But the doctors and nurses, and actually it's not true of the porters. The porters are very, anyway, kindly emotional. But I was dissatisfied with this and I knew something had to change. I was pushing 40, I was 35, I think, when I realized I really did have to change this. I'm writing anyway. I should really be writing. It's what I should be doing. And the office I was working in was in the city and it was opposite a pub. It was in Cloth Fair, you know, that little maze of streets behind Smithfield there. And it was opposite a pub, and in the summer people used to come out and sit on the sidewalk on the pavement, and when they'd finished they'd just leave their glasses on the pavement. And I came out in this rather desperate state one day, pushing my bike, and I came out in the office, and there the entire pavement was full of glasses, empty glasses of beer. The pub had just closed and they were full of empty glasses of beer, and I tried to wheel my bike down the pavement to get onto the road, and I smashed a couple of glasses and they went smashing into the road. And this made me suddenly really angry. All my frustration came to the surface, and I just walked down the road with my bike, hitting all the beer glasses into the gutter and leaving a smashed glass all behind me. It was very embarrassing, shameful behavior. I mean, I was 35, I shouldn't have been doing things like that. I had to go to the pub and apologize, and they agreed that I didn't have to pay for the glasses because nobody should have left them there, but I had to put money in the charity box and try and figure out what else I should do. And then I did start writing. Now, the first thing I wrote is this document, Human Stones. I was just showing Alice and Rosie. That's a picture of the two-man luge at the Winter Olympics. These guys dress up in padded suits because they're going to go very fast. And they kind of sit in each other and on this padded luge and go zooming down the road. And the piece is called Human Stones. I'd like to read a bit, if that's okay. Because this actual book is from 1987. It's 33 years old. And I dug it out and read the introduction, and I was shocked at what I'd written in the introduction. There's a quote to start with: "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." And then it says, "Here's a collection of stories about people whose lives have been so mixed up with the world of sticks and stones that they've spilled over and become part of the landscape, which, since humans appeared on the scene, includes buildings and machines, as well as rocks and plants." Now, I hadn't remembered that I'd sorted out that trilogy between buildings, machines, and landscapes so early on in my writing career. And I'm going to read one just to get my voice, to get used to speaking, really, apart from anything else. It takes a couple of minutes. Let's give it a try, okay? It's called The Dirty Chapel. Margaret's father, King Bela IV of Hungary, faced the Tatar hordes on the other side of the river as the last upholder of the faith. At that time, the city of Buda was on one side of the Danube and the city of Pest on the other, as if waiting for a bridge to hyphenate them. The king knelt before the altar and prayed for victory in the coming battle, promising his 3-year-old daughter to God if this boon be granted. And sure enough, Margaret soon found herself in the care of the nuns at Spelato. She took to her new life with a thoroughness that was to become notorious. A degree of sacrifice is implicit in the convent, but she carried her self-immolation to extremes that could almost be described as willful. She lived under a continual shower of sacrificial meal. Her status as a princess and her fierce intellect put all around her in a state of deference, and perhaps this explains why she chose the métier of filth to confirm her humility. She sought out all that was menial, repulsive, exhausting, and insanitary to abuse her body. On one occasion, she contrived to push 2 visiting friars into the midden so that she could take it upon herself to clean their trembling bodies. On another, she went out into the plague-ridden streets to help load the dead onto the carts, returning to the convent covered in the stains of burst boils. She performed the most nauseating services to the sick, allowing the bedridden to defecate into her hands and sucking the pus from her pores with her mouth. She made a study of squalor and neglect so profound that even her own sisters started to shrink from her presence. When she washed their feet at the end of Lent, starved as she was for 40 days of food and sleep and dirtier than the ashes themselves, they hastened away to wash themselves all over again, in case the lice that infested her habits should contaminate their own. In time, this distance they maintained came to suit her. She despised the scrubbing and cleaning that went on all over the convent, the perfect spectre of the abbey, and even the pure and simple sound of the matins bell. When she discovered that one of the pigsties was empty, she decided to make her own place for prayer, which would float above the petty cleanliness of the world, like the flotsam on the incoming tide. She filled the pigsty with rubbish. Her altar and cross, her church plate and her icons were all worn-out things which had been thrown away. She smeared the walls with pig's manure and stuck shards of broken glass in it until the interior glowed. She spent more and more of her time shut up in the place, matching her prayers to the grunts of the pigs in the next sty, attempting to locate a faith so contagious that anyone exposed to it would be converted immediately, like one infected by a disease. At 28, she died an old woman, her body racked by the austerity she had imposed upon it. Now, there are several of those things, and I showed them. This is the first thing I'd written, remember, way back in 1987. I think I probably just turned 40, in fact. So this counts as a midlife crisis. It's changed to become a writer. And if anybody's thinking of having one, I do recommend it. It's a great idea. You have to change everything, but it's worth it. But I showed these to an editor called Anne Rickbert, who was a friend of my dad's, and she said she'd have a look at what I was writing and give me some advice. And she said, "Paul, your writing is ice cold. These pieces have no feeling of emotion in them at all. You must learn to do dialogue." And I said, "Dialogue, but that doesn't sound like what I want to do. That's imitating reality. That's not the thing itself." And she said, "This is Writing isn't imitation. And she said, dialogue opens up the page. It introduces white space into a page of text, which people find helpful because it's not such a struggle to get through it. Strange advice, but good advice, I think. So after that, I wrote a book about Nicholas Owen. It was called The House of Nicholas Owen, and it was a description of Nicholas Owen's life's work. He was a Jesuit. He was a laborer, but he'd been drafted in to help build the priest holes in the houses of in the great houses, which refused to become Protestant when Elizabeth came on the throne. It's a complicated story, the recusancy. I'm not going to try and go into it, but the Jesuits sent across people to say secret mass in these unconverted households, which were illegal and punishable with tremendous torture. And so Nick Owen was given the job of building what are called priest holes into the fabrics of the building. And they have to be very efficiently hidden. You know, the police would come in and they'd knock on the door, on the walls to hear hollow things behind it. They'd rip up all the floorboards. They'd search the place properly. So he had to be very ingenious at it. And what struck me was that it was the time of Elizabeth, the around the time of 1600, when architecture was full of ciphers and tricks and illusions, secretive stuff. But it was also these hiding holes that he made had to be entirely functional. They just had to work. The only thing that mattered about them was that they had to work. And I was very interested in this extreme early modernism appearing. So I went and showed it to another family friend who happened to live down the road. He was John Summerson. I was friends with his boys, his sons. We used to play together, and he was a distant and august figure until by the time I got to see him when he was 80, he was at the end of it all. He was shaking with Parkinson's, but still a kind, generous man. And I said, "What do you think about this House of Nicholas Owen? Will it go anywhere?" And he was interested in the subject. He was a devout man. He told me all atheists are bloody fools. And I must say, as I'm pushing up to that situation that he was in, I can imagine turning to heaven for a bit of help. But one thing he said to me is that he'd noticed a couple of things which didn't appear in the national biography of Nicholas Owen. And he said, "Where'd you get these things from?" And I said, "Oh, I made those up." And he said, "You can't do that. It's called poisoning the wells of truth. You can't make things up." And this was such a nice counterpoint to Anne Brickworth's advice to make the dialogue up, that I decided then that I wasn't going to be an academic writer after all. I was going to indulge in dialogue. I was going to use the truth as the matrix for invention. I was going to not have footnotes. This became a real thing for me. When I was teaching in Antwerp, trying to find a publisher for my fourth book, How to Like Everything. And I thought Antwerp artists might do it, so I showed it to the people there. And one of them picked a book up, Cultivated Wilderness book, and said, "There's no footnotes in here, no footnotes." As though that disqualified it from, well, it did in fact disqualify it from consideration. And it came to me very strongly that what those footnotes are about are corroborations. You make an assertion, you have to, you know, Wikipedia has citation needed everywhere. You make an assertion and you have to follow it up with a bit of knowledge that's been gleaned by somebody else on the same subject. The world of knowledge expands in coordination with itself. Yeah, so I wasn't going to write academic books, but I was still teaching architecture, because one of the things I neglected to mention to people when they asked me what I did was that I was teaching. And I kind of ended up in second year teaching Kingston in 1990. It really did feel like ending up there. It was temporary. I hadn't managed to get any of these books published. And I entered a second argumentative phase. I discovered I wrote about it at the beginning of Cultivated Wilderness. Show this to camera. Not so long ago, I was teaching undergraduates in the School of Architecture. It was a very argumentative time. One of the other teachers thought that Jim Dine's drawing of a coat hanger, that one rendered in soft graphite as though it were a study of the Venus de Milo, was sublime art. The bringing of the ordinary into the realm of consciousness, he called it. How I yelled at him. I thought he was corrupting youth with that sort of talk, so I yelled. You would have thought I was a baby in a carriage. The two of us sat there surrounded by bemused students while he defended his narrative concoctions and I loudly berated his pretension. Every time I pick up a coat hanger, I marvel at it, was what I shouted. There is no ordinary in the world. No two things are the same. I said I thought that he'd been fooled by the machinery. If you look hard enough, I insisted, you'll see that no two things are the same. I came across him once with a bunch of students poring over photographs of men and women who were oiled and naked and penetrating each other with lighted candles. Is this the thing they call art? He was using the images to generate a discussion about spatial syntax. Look, man, he said when I stopped to pour scorn on his project, you're early Wittgenstein and I'm late Wittgenstein. That's the difference between us. Frustration, again, causing these furious arguments, but it was a fantastic spur for me. I knew that I knew that architecture wasn't just buildings. It hadn't registered with me how prescient I'd been in saying it was landscapes and machines and buildings. So I decided to write that out, and that's where What is Architecture came from. Architecture is not everything, but it's more than buildings. It is the art of the land. Landscapes, buildings, and machines. And I'd learnt enough by now to realize that you should show your stuff to people if you want to know anything about it. So I was showing it to everybody I knew who had any influence, and one of these guys was James Gowan. He said, why did you write it, Paul? He said, if you can design buildings, why write about them? Why not design them instead? And I tried to explain that writing is really about people. So writing about architecture is a vehicle for writing about people, because writing is about other people. Architecture is about the land. Writing is about other people. Music is about the spirit. That's how the spiel went. And I was telling him about something I'd just seen that day. It was a house. What do you do now? You're working at home, the doorbell goes. Shall I leave it or go and answer it? Can you wait while I answer it? Is that okay to do?
Go for it, Paul.
Right. I think this future project of everybody working at home is going to work. It's just a little less efficient, really. Anyway, I was talking to James, who was asking me, why, if you can design a building, why wouldn't you do that instead of writing about it? And I was trying to explain, there's a house around the corner from me, big house, 4-story house, brick built with stucco on it, and part of the stucco decoration are the coins on the corner of the building. And because it's Kentish town, the stucco had all started falling off the building, so the guy was putting it back up there, and he'd stripped the plaster back off the facade. And the bits of bricks behind the coins, you know what coins are? They're representations of the cornerstones of a building. The cornerstones of the building are the strongest part of the building, and they're exaggerated in relief on a Renaissance building. And these are imitation Renaissance buildings built in 1890, etc., etc., etc. And so the coins are made of plaster, representing the strongest part of the building, but the bricks behind, because they're covered in plaster, are cheaper than the facing bricks of the rest of the building. So less strong than the bricks of the rest of the building, even though they're representing the corner of the building, which is more strong. And I was very moved by this observation. I don't know why I was so moved by it. And James thought it was interesting, but hardly worth writing a book about. But my point was, is that about architecture or is it about people? Now, Bob Evans showed up at Kingston to give a lecture, so I showed what is architecture to him. He showed it to MIT, and they liked it and they published it. And what is architecture? I had learnt enough about writing. I'd learned from Anne about doing dialogue, but I think I'd learnt about writing as though watching a movie, scenographically, description of everything, jump cuts. And what usually happens is you write, if you do a project, what I found is that if I wrote a book, if I wrote What is Architecture, the next one would come along really before the ink was dry on the first one. And the second one was about landscape. Architecture is landscapes, buildings and machines. So I'm determined to write a book about the landscapes, which is called The Cultivated Wilderness. And that's the book with the red cover here, where I discovered how to structure a thing. It's about landscape as event rather than a series of projects, but landscape as an event with a result. So they start with, I've got to read this because I'm losing it. They start with different scales. And the biggest scale is geography, which has the 7 wonders of the world and Antarctica in it. Then there's chorography, which has got Scotland and Flavorland in it. And then there's topography, which has the London Basin and the Western Front in it. And this structural armature was another big important thing. So I had the way to do it. I knew about dialogue and I knew about making armatures. For Artificial Love, which was the next book and about the machines, the structure was Shakespeare's 7 ages of man: infant, schoolboy, lover, soldier, justice, pantaloon, oblivion. I've just entered pantaloon. I wrote Artificial Love when I was the justice. Pantaloon is somebody who is forgetful, clinging to outmoded ideas. I'm not obsessed with this, but I'm interested in it. All the time I've been teaching, I started teaching when I was 26 years old, so I was like a brother or a cousin to the students I was teaching. And then while I was teaching in America later on, in my 50s, I was like a father to the people I was teaching. But now I'm like the grandpa to the people I'm teaching. And I had a grandpa moment at the RCA recently when I was talking about public space. They'd asked me to give a lecture to the public space unit, the studio doing public space as a subject. And I went along and I was talking about the different public spaces in the different capitals of Europe. The beautiful Russian War Memorial in Berlin and the spaces open to the air in Rome. And when I was doing London, I was doing the set pieces of like Trafalgar Square, which are full of cultural meaning. And one of the statues in Trafalgar Square, I pointed out, was Henry Havelock, and he's standing there on the top of his plinth, and it says, Henry Havelock, soldiers, your privations, your valors, your sufferings shall never be forgotten by a grateful country. Henry Havelock, 1857. And it struck me that no one in the country knows who Henry Havelock is. So the question of what effectiveness these memorials have is a big question. And this question came from the back of the room. One of the students poked her hand in the air and said, oh, this all seems very old-fashioned, she said. which was the grandpa moment. This all seems very old-fashioned. She said, she was holding her phone and she said, here's where public space is. Are you interested in technology at all? So it was amusing to find recently that this issue about cultural knowledge embedded in statues has become such a hot topic. So I'd finished what is architecture really. I'd finished the buildings and the landscapes, and I thought what I'm trying to do next is to write about everything. If architecture is not everything, what is? And so I constructed a book called How to Like Everything, which strapline was, believe in nothing, know what you know, live in the present. Know what you know is a Gertrude Steinism. There is knowledge and there's what you know, which is related to the observation about footnotes, if you understand what I mean. And I sent it off to MIT. It was my 5th book. I thought they were going to love it as much as I do. And it came back. It was rejected from MIT. And the guy said, it was Roger Conover, the the commissioning editor there, who I'd been dealing with up till now quite successfully. And he said, we can't do it. And I said, well, why not? And he said, because we're not in the business of publishing memoirs. It's all written in the first person. Now, all my books are written in the first person, and I couldn't see what the problem with it was, but he'd suddenly taken against the idea of publishing a memoir. So that was pretty difficult. And I met Joseph Rickvert at a Bob Evans lecture. Joseph is another MIT author. I mean, he's a big deal guy. But he's another MIT author, which is sort of why I knew him. And I was sitting behind him in this, waiting for this lecture to start. And he turned around and said, "Have you heard from Roger lately?" And I said, "Yeah, he just rejected my last book." And he said he did the same thing to me. He said he didn't publish memoirs. So we sat there nonplussed by this. And afterwards I was trying to figure out what it was. Was it because of the flouting of the academic rules with the footnotes and the academic rigor mortis was not being looked after? And then I thought, Roger's an intelligent guy. He's up to date with philosophy. Maybe it's the ontological turn which has made him go against personal experience. He doesn't want to publish books about personal experience. He wants to publish books about existence. It was a guess. So I went to look into that, and this is where I start trying to talk about the next book, because the ject part of reject means cast. Reject means cast back. Abject means cast down. Subject means cast under, sub under. Object means cast against, ob is against. And in order to figure out about this ontological turn, I was reading not Graham Harman. I decided to read Sloterdijk on Leibniz. And I don't know if you know Sloterdijk's book, Philosophical Temperaments. It's not a history of philosophy. It's about philosophers and how their different brains perceive everything in the world. And what I got from reading this thing about Leibniz was that at that time, let's say 1600, people were subjects of the king. And by analogy, they were subjects of God. They were cast under God and under the king. The world itself was the object, which was the thing that was cast against. And when you have the understanding that you can slice the head off the king and do away with him, your subjecthood turns into something else. It turns into a matter of negotiation with the other subjects and not just being subjected to the king's will. So if you strike the head off the king, or you stop you stop viewing God as a ruler, it makes sense of that Descartesian thing, I think, therefore I am. It's a declaration of freedom, really. And it's sneered at by the object-oriented people because they call it correlationist, that you make a correlation between thinking and humanity, which means that you're rejecting the rest of the world in its state of existence because you're concentrating on the human existence. I can't see that. Well, I think it's more interesting to think about this other Declaration of Independence at the moment. All beings are objects in the end, except to themselves. And most of all that struck me in this Sloterdijk piece was the idea that the 17th century still reverberated to magic, that magic was a philosophical topic at that time, while things were turning into rationalism. Now, magic is a difficult thing to use. I want to look into it more. I want to write about magic. I want to try and understand what magic is. And I would even like to revivify magic. I need my Caliban. I want to quote Caliban to you. Sorry, I thought I had all my pieces of paper in order. 16th century, Shakespeare. Exploration of the world, discovery of the new world. Discovery that there are things in the new world which aren't written about in the ancient text, new world. And Caliban is a representative of the natives of that new world. Could be Native American, could be Native African, who is approached by the shipwrecked Westerners, made drunk, and he tries to teach them about the place they've come to, because they can't believe the tempest of the island is so magical. And he says, "Be not afraid. The isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about my ears, and sometimes voices that if I had then waked after long sleep will make me sleep again. And then in dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again." I've always loved that piece, ever since I was a schoolboy. It seemed to be so full of the kind of feeling that we've had lately, you know, with this lockdown, and how many people are saying, you know, this is really quite interesting, not having such social pressure, and listen to the birds sing. No pollution in the sky, everything is quiet, nature's wonderful, getting on with it. But my real question is, whether it's a possibility that magic could combine subject and object and get away from this difficulty about the difference between experience and existence. And there is still a lively magical atmosphere in the world. I don't know if you're familiar with Eduardo Cohen. He's one of the anthropologists studying Amazon, what do you call an Amazon Native American? He says, "Settling down to sleep under our hunting camp's thatched lean-to in the foothills of Samaco volcano, Juanico warned me, sleep face up. If a jaguar comes, he'll see you can look back at him and he won't bother you. If you sleep face down, he'll think you're prey and he'll attack." If Juanico was saying a jaguar sees you as being capable of looking back, a self like himself, a you, he'll leave you alone. But if she should come to see you as prey, and you may well become dead meat. Totem poles. there's my totem pole painting, are full of shamanic magic in the sense of generational truths, stories about your origin. So there is that kind of magic, which is the old magic that still exists, the shape-shifting magical magic. But it occurs to me that there are a couple of other ways that magic is writable about or significant now. One of them I came across when I was at a launch party for a book of photographs, and I had to say a few words about it because I've written the introduction. I'm doing it, this one, no names. And I said, the thing about photographs is that they're not art. They're something else, but they're not art. By which I meant that they're made inside the machine by some inexplicable process, if you see what I mean. And the intentions of the artist are of a different nature than the intentions of an artist who's writing or painting. And this went down really badly, this observation that photographs aren't art. I couldn't find a single person in the room who agreed with me until I got home and I read Wilhelm Flusser's Towards the Theory of Photography and found in there a very similar position. And not only that, he said that photographs are more like magic than they are like art. They're set up, there's a process which transforms them into something else. And I think camouflage is the same, it's a similar proposition. It could be written about in a similar way, that you take something, you take a paintbrush and you do something to it, it disappears into the background. That's magic in a literal sense. And then also in the 16th century sense, there's the question of rhetoric and the art of persuasion and getting people to do things when they didn't know they wanted to do them. That's magic. And also the one that is the biggest conundrum, and which I'm going to need to find a lot of advice on, is how there are a number of big scientific concepts which we're waiting for answers to. The Big Bang, the wave particle, the origin of life, dark matter. These are metaphorical titles given to things which are not understood. People are hardworking trying to understand them in a scientific sense, but that's what magic is. Simon Chalmers wrote, he made a series of films about art called The Power of Art. Beautifully written, full of Simon Chalmers. He's very annoying to watch because he's got so much ego bubbling out of him, but very good at what he does. And in the film about Mark Rothko, he quotes Rothko as saying, there's two things. There's one nice thing about being an abstract expressionist. The time in New York in the 50s when everyone was free and we had nothing to lose, he says. We had nothing to lose. And if you read Milton Friedman's account, Give My Regards to 8th Street, I think it's called, he makes a similar point. It was a time back there in the 50s in New York when nobody knew what art was. It was a time of great freedom. Nobody knew what art was. It lasted about 6 weeks. But Rothko goes on to talk about his paintings, his big somber paintings, and said, there's so much noise in the world. What I'm trying to make is pockets of silence where people can root and regenerate. He was talking at a time when art had gone very noisy indeed with Andy Warhol. But what he's talking about is the kind of reverence for nature that I was alluding to in magic, except that I don't think it's silence that we need. I think it's sound that we need, like Caliban needed. And so an ambition arises to write pockets of noise that will give people this separation. Now, Gertrude Stein is the most ambitious writer I've ever come across. She's written a lot about her explicit ambition as she's discovered what she was trying to do. In fact, what am I trying to do? What I am trying to do is a Gertrude Steinian kind of thing to say. There's one set of poems she's wrote called The Tender Buttons, which was an attempt to write as the Cubist painters had painted. So she writes about objects from all sides. And then there's a very difficult to explain and interesting essay called What is English Literature? Which I'm going to try and explain to you. The theme of the attempt is to describe what English literature has been, how it's come to be, how it's changed, what it is about to become, and what she's doing about making it in the future. And it all comes down to the English understanding of the island life, that everything in the island is part of our life. And when you were Chaucer, you just had to write down lists of the things in the island and you'd have poetry. She says, read Chaucer, you'll see what I mean. After that, things got a little more complicated with things coming in from the world, but still it was the island daily life. And then there came the time of choosing words to go to each other, next to each other. She says, read Elizabethan, she wouldn't call it that because she's American. She'd say, read 16th century English and you'll see what I mean. And Shakespeare's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps on his petty pace from day to day. These are words chosen to be next to each other. And she says after that it all went a little haywire in the Restoration period when nobody knew what was going on, but then it settled down into the 18th century era of Jane Austen, when people wrote in, not in words, not in chosen words, but in sentences, like Jane Austen, da-da-da-da-da-da, colon, da-da-da-da-da-da. She keeps saying throughout this essay, read it and you'll see what I mean. So you go to the source, you read it, and you do see what she meant. It's amazing. And then the last move in English literature was Victorian literature, which had to explain to England, living in this island daily life, how they had come to own the rest of the world after the Battle of Waterloo. This is how she puts it, how I'm prepared to see it. And she says, the attempt to explain the rest of the world in terms of the daily island life gives rise to an emotional impasse, which only phrases can overcome. She says, read Tennyson, you see what I mean. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Into the valley of death is a phrase. The 600 is an emotional phrase. And she says, if you read any Victorian literature, you'll find it full of these attempts to explain how the world belongs to England. And then, of course, lastly, it all disappears in the 1918. England has lost the world, and now it's America's turn to use, to advance the English literature, which she says is her turn. And what happens is that the phrases give way to paragraphs, which are not part of a daily island life, they're just part of the world. And nothing is connected to it, to anything else in any profound way. There's a big disconnection, and the connections are made by the writer. Detached paragraphs carrying an emotional charge. And I'm impressed by that, and I found myself writing in shorter and shorter forms. I mean, Instagram has done it to me, I suppose, but the original commission from Building Design with Ellis set me up with this 300-word target. So with slogans and battle cries, I took that target very seriously, and they are all 300 words. They're spot on 300 words. And then the project expanded a bit to include the building regulations. How did it come to conclude the building regulations? I can't remember. It just sort of rolled on to the next thing. And then after that, a third section about materials. And this is another three-part look at architecture: the intention, the use, and the material. The regulations are about use. The slogans are about intention. But they are detached paragraphs, but they carry an emotional charge which links them together, so that if you read them all together, what Gertrude Stein talks about meaning floating off the surface of the page becomes real. I've come to the end of my list of things to say, so I think that must be the end of the talk.